our final session for the Georgia Conference on Child Abuse and Neglect virtual conference series that we've had to adapt for you guys. So we're so glad that so many of you could participate all the way through for these past 3 weeks. And I just wanted to congratulate again our bingo winners from yesterday. We had Rosalind Davis, who is a social service coordinator and probation clerk office at the juvenile court, and then also for Rebecca James, who works at Clayton County Library. So we're so excited to be sending you guys some resources, and we know they'll be well used out there in the community. And for today, we are super excited to have Cailin O'Connor. She is the Senior Associate at the Center for the Study of Social Policies. And I have to have that pulled up, the CSSP. I always say is an acronym, so it's hard to transition for the full one after that. We're so excited to have you talk about strengthening families and protective factors, building those throughout our communities. As many of you guys know, that PCA Georgia houses the Strengthening Families Initiative in Georgia. So I'll go ahead and let you get started.
Thank you so much, Jill, and thanks to everyone for inviting me to present and for being part of this conference. I'm very happy to be able to talk to all of you. Wish it could be in person, but I think we're all making the most of this situation. So I'm glad to be able to do this with you. So I'm going to talk today about strengthening families throughout our communities, which is a newer direction for strengthening families, both nationally, at the home of the initiative and in a lot of the states and other places that are implementing strengthening families. I'm going to start with a very brief review of strengthening families and the protective factors framework, because I know that most of you are probably familiar with it, and so I don't want to use too much time on it, but in case some of you are newer to it, I will review that quickly. And then we'll talk about how family protective factors are affected by community conditions. And I think that's something that's been increasingly clear or hard to not see as we go through this these crises of 2020. And so we're going to talk about how those are affected, and then a new framework of building blocks of an early learning community, which I believe bridge well with the strengthening families protective factors. And we'll get to some thinking about identifying action steps for each of your, for your own communities. And I'll look forward to hearing about some of the things that you all come up with. So without further ado, I will jump in on this brief review of the strengthening families framework. I always like to talk about these 4 big ideas behind strengthening families. I think we often get caught up in memorizing and reciting the protective factors, which is really important, but also taking a step back to think about why strengthening families is what it is and what it's meant to do. So the first big idea is the most fundamental, which is this idea of focusing on protective factors and not just risk. And when CSSP developed the protective factors framework, it was in a landscape back in 2001 where most of our work on child abuse prevention as a field was focused on risk factors. So let's find the families that meet certain risk factors, offer them services or require them to get some services in order to address those deficits. And while some people can do that in a really positive way and still build positive relationships with families, we know that in general, that approach leads to an adversarial relationship, or at least a not supportive relationship when parents don't feel seen and recognized. And we believe that in a lot of the systems that intervene with or attempt to support families, coming at it from a deficit model was really contributing to the inequitable outcomes that we see in those systems. So focusing on protective factors in addition to risk, not ignoring risk, but starting with protective factors, looking at what is working for so many families that are thriving. What is working for families that have had hard times and got through it? What are the things that are strengths that we know if we focus on those, not only does it change the nature of our relationship with parents, but it also gives us positive things to work for, and rather than just addressing this risk, and this risk. We could talk a lot more about why we focus on protective factors and how that shifts our practice, but I just wanted to underline it as a key reason that strengthening families brought something new to the field. It was really that shift to say, let's focus on family strengths and have a scientific approach to researching and understanding what those strengths are and how we can support them. Then the second big idea is that strengthening families is an approach and not a model. That is a very intentional decision not to create an evidence-based program that would be implemented with a certain audience in a certain way over a certain number of sessions, all of those things that are the characteristics of some really good, really positive programs and models, but we wanted this to be something that would be much more flexible. So it's an approach that you can apply to your work with families and with children in any setting. We started with early care and education as the primary service delivery model where this approach could be applied, but it's also being applied in home visiting and in family resource centers and in pediatricians' offices and in child welfare jurisdictions. And in a lot of different settings where the flexibility of the approach allows it to say, you know, I work at the library offering story time. I can do that in a way that builds family protective factors without changing the fundamental thing that I do, which is story time, right? So we're not saying throw out everything you do and do strengthening families instead, but rather take this approach in your interactions with families, regardless of what model you're using. The third big idea is a changed relationship with parents, and I alluded to that when I talked about why we want to focus on protective factors. But really underlying all of this is the idea that you can't improve outcomes for children if you're not building a positive relationship with their parents. And there are a lot of different ways you can do that, but it needs to come from a place of saying, this is a partnership between a provider and a parent who both want the best possible outcomes for a child, and letting the parent be the lead member of the team of people who are helping that child to get to where they want to go or helping that family get to where they want to go. So a lot of our systems, especially the intervening ones, like not to call out child welfare and criminal justice, but those systems and others that intervene with families when we believe there is a problem, but also even programs that serve all families, regardless of there being a particular problem, often take kind of an adversarial approach to parents. Or, you know, when we started going out into early care and education programs, a lot of providers kind of roll their eyes at having to build relationships with parents. We used to jokingly start our presentations by saying, you know, how many of you went into early care and education because you just love working with adults? Nobody raises their hand to that, because people go into early care and education because they love kids. And for some people, it's a little bit of a learning curve to realize that working with the parents is really critical to working well with kids. So that changed relationship with parents. And when we look at our parallel Youth Thrive framework, it's a changed relationship with youth who are involved in our systems or our programs. And then the fourth big idea is about alignment with developmental science. And that's, you know, really why we focus on families with young children in particular, and then on adolescents, because those are two critical periods of development where we know that experiences matter a lot, or have the potential to matter a lot for people's lifelong experiences and outcomes. And when we focus in on those developmental periods and apply the knowledge that is growing every day in our field about early childhood brain development and about early relational health and the importance of foundational relationships, all of that can be applied by implementing this strength-based approach built around these research-based protective factors. And as more and more of that research grows, we continue to always question the framework and say, does it still, you know, are we learning anything from newer research on brain development that tells us these protective factors are off? So far, we haven't found any research that causes us to question them, but it is a continual process of making sure that we are aligned with and supporting providers to be aligned with what we know about developmental science. So I'm going to continue on here, but I just wanted to pause and say, if you want to enter questions as we go, we will take some pauses along the way, and Jill and others are monitoring those questions and will let me know. But I'll just say, if a question comes up that's sort of a clarifying one, please feel free to break in and let me know, and I can answer that right away. Otherwise, we'll have time for questions as we go. All right, so I wanted to share a couple of sort of inspirational quotes that I've found to be really helpful. So as we go through the presentation, I'll share a few of these. This one is from Dr. Carl Bell, who was a psychiatrist community psychiatrist at the University of Illinois. And he just summed up all of our work really well when he said risk factors are not predictive factors because of protective factors. And this is one of those things where the science is filling in every day to better explain why that is the case, how protective factors and positive experiences and all of these different ways of characterizing strengths and positivity, how they interact with negative risk factors, adversity, ACEs, all of that, so that those negative things, while we know they have strong correlation to poor outcomes, they are not predictive. It's not, we can never say everyone who experiences X will then have Y outcome. And that's because a lot of things happen between X and Y, and a lot of positive things are around that equation that make it not that clear. So we know that when we build strengths and promote positive experiences and positive relationships, that buffers children and adults from poor outcomes. And, sorry, it's not advancing. There we go. Just a brief review of what our actual protective factors are that we talk about within strengthening families. So these are characteristics of families that make positive outcomes more likely and make negative outcomes less likely, even in the face of adversity. So they are parental resilience, which we define as a parent's ability to thrive and continue to be the parent they want to be, even as other challenges are around them, often even to grow and be stronger after going through some adversity. All of that is encapsulated in parental resilience. Then we talk about social connections, which includes a lot of different types of social connections. And I think we've all seen this year how some of those social connections can take place even when we're not in person together. But the kind of social support, someone to talk to about a parenting challenge, someone to watch parent children of a similar age to yours and see what works and what doesn't for them that you might try out with your kids. Lots of benefits we get from social connections. I'll also say that social connections provide a lot of concrete support, which is another one of our protective factors. A lot of us are lucky enough that our social networks provide for a lot of our concrete supports. And so when you have a strong social network, you have somebody you can call to pick up your kid from preschool when you get caught up in a meeting, or you have an appointment, or you have something, a car accident, that there's somebody you can call to help you out. That is a form of concrete support that comes through the social connection. The next protective factor is knowledge of parenting and child development. And that is really for parents, not just memorizing developmental milestones. Maybe nobody needs to do that exactly, but more of understanding what to expect as your child grows, understanding what's normal and what might be cause for concern, understanding what your role is as a parent, and having a lot of different strategies in your toolbox of what you could use as behavior management strategies, and really just feeling confident in your role. The next one is concrete support in times of need, which I alluded to, as some families get a lot of that support through social connections. But other families don't have those strong social connections, and all families sometimes have needs that are not met by the social network and can't be. So when we talk about domestic violence intervention, or food pantries, or unemployment insurance being extended, those are all concrete supports in times of need that for most people, the social connections are never going to be able to provide that. And we do need formal systems in order to make sure that all families have those concrete supports. And then finally is the social emotional competence of children. And here we're really talking about the parental role in nurturing that social and emotional competence. So that is very closely connected to knowledge of parenting and child development, because understanding the importance of talking and singing with your baby, that's building their social emotional competence. And it's something that some parents do very naturally, or have seen it modeled, and others might need to learn that that's an important thing to do. But it builds their child's social emotional competence, and it builds the relationship between the two of them. There's also a lot that happens, for example, in childcare settings, that builds children's social emotional competence that then comes back into the home. So the 3-year-old who comes home saying we should use our words can be a powerful change in dynamic in a home where that hasn't been their way of practicing. So sometimes the programs that are serving children, by building those skills in children, help them bring it home to their parents. And then those programs can also directly talk to parents about how to nurture that social emotional competence. And I know in Georgia, many of you are also using Youth Thrive, which is our parallel framework of protective and promotive factors. You'll see it's very similar. It's even the same colors as the previous slide. These protective and promotive factors, I'll just explain a little bit about why we talk about them a little bit differently. In the youth development field, the phrase promotive factor is used more widely. And so it's included here, which is actually, if you really wanted to say scientifically, as I mentioned when I described our strengthening families protective factors, I said they both prevent negative outcomes and promote positive outcomes, even in the face of adversity. That actually is the definition of both a protective factor, which makes a positive outcome more likely in the face of adversity, and a promotive factor, which just makes a positive outcome more likely overall. So just to be clear, we use that phrase more in the Youth Thrive side of things, but it's true for this framework across the lifespan. And of course, as youth get older, and as we're serving them directly, sometimes in settings where we don't have contact with their families or have very limited contact with their families, we can begin to focus on their own characteristics and competencies, hopefully also still supporting their families. It's not that parents don't need those strengthening families protective factors once their children turn 12. It's more that we can start focusing on both. And we know there are a lot of youth serving programs that have pretty limited contact with parents. And then when we're in the context of a child welfare setting, you're taking that protective factors approach with the parents, but for a child who's old enough, you're also taking the approach with them to help them understand and identify their own strengths and where they want to grow, having youth involved in building their own case plans where appropriate, or setting their own goals for what they want to do and framing it around these strengths can be really positive. I think that's all I'll say about Youth Thrive, but if anybody has questions about it, I can come back to it as well. Okay, so back on the strengthening families side, where strengthening families and Youth Thrive are very connected, but we'll be focusing mostly on strengthening families today. We have used this, we call it the daisy. I don't know exactly what the image is, but looking at all of the different systems that touch the lives of families when they have young children, and really highlighting how in the center of all that are the families themselves and their protective factors. And when we work across these programs and talk to providers in all of these different systems, we can ensure that everyone understands the importance of focusing on family strengths, that everyone's speaking the same language around family strengths, and families get a consistent message when they're talking to their early care and education provider and their home visitor and their pediatrician. They're not getting a lot of different approaches and different language. So that's really powerful. But one of the things that this graphic didn't account for is that all of these systems exist within a community, and that most parents, if you ask them, where they're raising their kids, they're not going to say at this doctor's office, this preschool, and this family resource center, right? They're going to say the name of their neighborhood or their town, or in a more rural area, maybe their county or their school district, but they're going to name a community, not a set of programs. So that brings us to this great quote from Dr. Yuri Bronfenbrenner, who was the developer of the socio-ecological model of human development, who said children don't grow up in programs, they grow up in families and in communities. And so when we're just thinking about children, we're really limiting what we can influence. And when we think about families, we're broadening our scope, but we really need to think about the communities that the families live in order to think about really changing outcomes for a large number of children at a time. So one of the things that we've talked about for a long time at CSSP is what a family support system would actually look like in a community. And I don't mean to suggest with that sort of hypothetical phrasing that this doesn't exist anywhere, but it is kind of a not hypothetical, but definitely ideal situation would be that we have light touch family support in the settings that families are in every day. So it is that story time at the library that I mentioned earlier, or it's even the grocery store, or the laundromat, the places that families go to take care of regular business, be it child related or not, that there would be light touch family support there, that the people they're meeting there understand family strengths and come from a positive have a positive attitude towards families coming in with children, and are generally supportive. And then the next step up is connections to and support from dedicated family support resources. So that's that there's a family resource center, and there's a flyer about that family resource center at the grocery store, and the people who work at the grocery store know what that is. So they might strike up a conversation with a parent who's in there with a child and say, oh, do you ever go to, the family fun night at the family resource center, or whatever that might be, that there are those connections there. And for those people in the light touch family support, let's talk about that librarian doing story time. If there's a family who really seems to be struggling, she knows who she can refer them to, or she can say, hey, let's let's see if somebody from the Family Resource Center can come to our story time next week and share some of what they do. And let's, make that connection a little more clearly for families, where somebody who's encountering them outside of a family support setting can look at them and say, oh, they seem stressed, they seem struggling, this child's behavior seems like it's a little much for the parent to manage. Maybe this is, maybe they could use more support. So when we have those dedicated family support resources, people might just go there directly, but they also will often be referred by someone who just told them, oh, my child had a speech delay and I went here and got a lot of help with it, that kind of thing. And then we want, of course, connections to more intensive services when needed, which is often going to happen first through a sort of gateway place like a family resource center or Help Me Grow screening line, that then they can say, okay, you do need more support, and here's where we can get it. And then navigation supports that make those connections for families and help them navigate these systems that unfortunately are very complicated and hard for people to get through. It takes a lot of advocacy, it takes a lot of persistence, it takes a lot of resilience to get the supports that your child or your family needs. And so having supports for people to navigate that can be really helpful. And then all across the bottom here, you'll see the common language and commitment to helping families build protective factors, which we think can be the glue across all of that, or the theme that runs through it, so that everybody's speaking the same language, as I said before. So I wanted to talk a little bit about, as we broaden out to thinking about the community more generally, how are family protective factors that we all care about influenced by community conditions? And I think some of this is really obvious, but some of it we just don't tend to talk about. So the first and most blaring one is economics and the family financial situation. So a family that's living in a community with really high unemployment, or in a high density poverty area, that just changes the stress that's on families and parents in particular. And it changes how available parents are to stare into their newborn's eyes, which we all know is a really important thing to do. And not everyone has the time to do that because they're running to the next thing, or they're so stressed by their own financial challenges that they can't zoom in on the baby in that way that we would love them to, right? And so family stress comes out in ways that might be very, in the worst case, lashing out at a child because of stressors from other situations. But even in more mild cases, just not being as available to the child, or those situations of where families verge on neglect because they have to choose, miss another day of work to stay home with a sick child, or leave the kid home in front of the TV and hope for the best, but be able to pay rent that month, right? So when families are in those situations where they have to make those choices, that spills over into the family relationship, or it can. It doesn't always. A lot of parents do a great job of kind of compartmentalizing those concerns and being present for their kids and figuring out what they need to do, but it is definitely an extra load of stress they're carrying. So community conditions then also influence sense of safety and actual safety for parents and for children. So if you're in a neighborhood with violence and you don't feel safe letting your kid run to the playground, that's another form of stress and a kind of constraint on family thriving. If you don't feel safe, walking around your neighborhood, that has implications for young children's motor development and also just for well-being for the family. So how safe a neighborhood is and how safe it feels can also have an impact on things like social connections. Often, we talk about parents being socially isolated, and we don't recognize that some parents are making a choice to be socially isolated because that feels safer to them than connecting with people around them who they don't feel safe with. And sometimes that's the right call. Sometimes they're being maybe more fearful than they need to be, but we should recognize that parents are making those choices sometimes, weighing the risks and benefits of different actions and deciding to just stay less socially connected in order to feel safer. But we want parents to have those social connections, and so changing those community conditions can make it easier for families to find the social connections that they do need. That merges into that sense of connection, as I was just talking about, but also just being part of a community where everyone has a sort of we're all in this together feeling versus one where everybody feels like they're on their own. That can matter a lot for family protective factors. Willingness to ask for help is another thing that can change based on some of these community conditions, whether there's a widely advertised, 211 or Help Me Grow line that you can call for help, and a sense that that's an okay thing to do, and a knowledge of, that you can do that or where you would go to ask for that help can matter a lot, both for concrete support, but also for things like, I'm really worried that my 3-year-old isn't putting together full sentences, and I'm not sure what I'm supposed to do about that, but knowing who you can ask for help on that and being willing to ask for that help can be really critical. And then access to healthy foods and green space are impacted a lot by what neighborhood people live in and what the community has done to address things like food deserts and community safety, as I mentioned. Sometimes there is green space available, but people don't use it. And so what does that mean the community needs to do to make that more accessible and appealing and safe for families? These are just some thoughts, and I'd love to hear your thoughts as well. We're going to get into some of the things that we can do in communities, and I think having some of these thoughts in mind might help you come up with things, or if there's something you think I left out here or got wrong, I'd love to hear that. So put it in the chat box or the Q&A, or save it up for your own thinking about what you might be able to do in your community. Okay, so I want to talk about our parallel body of work that is parallel and very connected to strengthening families, which is called Early Learning Nation. The vision of Early Learning Nation is that all families in the whole US would have all the opportunities and support they need to nurture and promote their children's early learning and healthy development. We have been working with the National League of Cities with funding from the Bezos Family Foundation for the last several years to develop tools and resources to help communities become early learning communities, because the foundation started with this bold vision of an early learning nation and realized that a grassroots up strategy, so starting with what communities were doing locally and building that up to what states and federal government and federal entities can do to promote it, would be a much more effective and realistic way of achieving becoming an early learning nation. So they turned to CSSP and NLC because we both have a lot of connections with folks at the community level and a lot of experience with community change. And so we've been working on defining what an early learning community is, and then working with groups of communities to figure out what they can change and do in their community based on their current resources and what they've already been doing and who's at the table. It's different in every community what makes sense to do, but we do have this sort of roadmap for how to identify what you're doing and what you could do more of or do better, and build an action plan and move forward. So there's a lot of information about that at earlylearningnation.com. I encourage you to check that out, but I'm going to give you kind of an overview of it today so that you can maybe think about whether it's something that your community would want to do or communities you're engaged with. take a drink so my voice doesn't sound so raspy. So when we started to work on defining an early learning community, I should give a shout out to the communities we worked with to develop this. They're all part of our network that's called EC Link. That's our Early Childhood Learning and Innovation Network for Communities. And EC Link is a group of now 14 communities that have been doing local early childhood system building for a long time. So we came to them and said, what does it mean for a community to be an early learning community? What does it mean to be a community where, as the vision says, all families have all the opportunities and supports they need to nurture and promote their children's learning and healthy development? And we came with that group, we boiled it down to 4 building blocks as well as 3 themes that you see at the bottom of this graphic, which the themes are a little too small, so we got to work on that. But the building blocks really help us to get beyond just thinking about the programs and services that are usually where our minds go first when we think about an early learning system or early childhood system, and really to think about the community more broadly. So we start with the first building block, which is community leadership, commitment, and public will to make early childhood a priority. And I'm going to talk about each of these in a little more detail, but not too much. There's a lot there, but I will explain more about what we mean by each of these. The second is the one that I think most of us are most comfortable with, which is quality services that work for all young children and their families. I'll also say the word all is the most important. Well, quality is really important, but all is very important in that statement, because a lot of communities that are doing really good work around early learning and early childhood are doing that really good work that's accessible to some families, but not all. And so in a lot of cases, even communities that are doing great work, the push and the stretch is to say who's not being served well, who are we not reaching, how do we change that so that all families in this community are getting the same level of quality. The third building block is neighborhoods where families can thrive. That's something that I think our early childhood field has been less engaged in, although more and more seeing the importance of neighborhoods, the built environment around families and what it means, what they have access to, how it feels, all of that. And then on the fourth building block, we talk about policies that support and are responsive to families. And the way I like to say this is that policies have a lot to do with whether it's easy to raise children in this community or not easy to raise children in this community. We can make it easier or we can not make it easier. And sometimes we even make it harder with the policies that we have in place. So as I mentioned, there are 3 themes at the bottom there. One is equity. So really, as I said, making sure that as we ask questions about how well our community is doing, we're asking it in a way that really uncovers those pockets that might not be served as well, and making sure that we are asking the right people to know how things are really going all across the community, not just the people who always show up for every meeting who we're used to hearing from. Family partnerships. Obviously, this came from the world of strengthening families, and so we weren't going to not have a theme of having families and family members and parents at the table, really shaping the work, both at the city or county level for shaping how do we want to become an early learning community, but also in each of these programs and services. There has to be an ethos of always involving parents in that work. And then a focus on results. So really saying, we don't want people to just run off and do stuff without any feedback loop of what difference it's making. And we all struggle in early childhood with, a lot of the outcomes that we work with and want to influence are distant. They're off in the future. So if we're working with babies, but our goal is kindergarten readiness, there's a little distance there, some time between and also a lot of other intervening factors between whether what we did made a difference for that outcome. But having a focus on results in that case might mean just really consistently talking to parents and finding out whether they feel like this program is working better for them than it used to, and then tweaking further as we need to. So it doesn't always have to be that high level research on population outcomes, but some form of paying attention to what did we do, what did we accomplish, what do we want to do differently going forward. So those run across all 4 of the building blocks. I'm going to talk about what each of these building blocks look like, not in huge detail, but you will see the detail up on your screen. So in each of the building blocks, As I said, we developed this with these members of EC Link who were working in communities that are probably as far along as anybody in the US at getting towards these. But even in those communities, they were clear that what we were describing was an ideal that they had not reached. So we describe these as targets within each building block. One phrase that I heard someone say once that I just love is there's a lot of different ways to get to Target, which, you know, as a mom who loves shopping at Target, that resonated, but also just of a Target more generally. There's a lot of different ways you might get to this. But what we do with the Early Learning Nation and Early Learning Community process is to look within each of these targets, how close are we to achieving it, and what could we do to get closer? So you'll see these targets in building block 1, there are 5 of them, and it ranges from, you know, the fact that local leaders are coming together to work together across systems. And in that target, you know, we start with just that they ever meet. And it goes up to like that they have a shared action plan and that they are collaborating and sharing resources. So there's those levels of what's the basic to get started and what means we're really doing this well for each of the targets. So there's a target about investing in young children and families. There's a target about general community understanding of the importance of early childhood. Then one about the rich network of informal supports that are available for families, and about community resources being accessible and easy to find and use. So these echo a lot of the points I was making earlier about what we want to see in a family support system, what we want to see for families to be able to thrive in their protective factors. All of that echoes through a lot of this. So when we go to building block 2, as I said, this is about the quality services. This is the one where a lot of us are most comfortable. And you'll see the first 3 targets are kind of a continuum of services, from the basic services that all families need to routine screening, identification, and referral, and then to the target 2.3, which is about families that are at risk or have identified needs getting the intensive services they need. And then also in this one, we have a target that calls out families and parents being engaged as partners. One about the supports for service providers that make this quality possible, and then about leaders using data to drive change in those systems. In the third building block, we talk about neighborhoods. And as I said, this is one where it feels to me like our early childhood field is kind of waking up to the importance of neighborhoods and the opportunity for intervention at the neighborhood level. So here the targets are about the built environment, that it's safe and families have access to basic services. That might not mean that every neighborhood or town has every single service, but that people can get to what they need. The second one is about economic and employment opportunities being available. Again, not necessarily in the neighborhood, but close by, easily accessible, public transportation available to access those things. You know, we're talking about communities that only have check cashing as opposed to a bank, and that really affects families. We need it to not be so difficult to get into banking or credit union, and we can look at that at a community level to see who doesn't have access to that. The third target here is probably across all of this, the one that's the hardest to measure and the least tangible, but also probably the one that our group members felt the most strongly about, was this idea that residents feel a sense of belonging and hope within their neighborhoods and have a connection to the broader community. And so one of the ways that I think about that is I live in a city that is often referred to as one of the best cities in America to raise children. And then if you look a little closer, it is also a community that has some of the worst disparities between Black children and white children for kindergarten readiness, for high school graduation. It is both held up as a great place to raise children and recognized increasingly as one of the hardest places in the country to raise a Black child. That tells to me that Black residents in this city, and I know this for a fact, don't feel a sense of belonging in the community, don't feel like when the mayor talks about our city, they're talking about my neighborhood, right? Because it's the overall messaging about our community does not align with the experiences of certain communities within, neighborhoods or population groups within our city. And so that really undermines that sense of belonging and connection. Although it does not necessarily undermine that feeling of hope and collective efficacy that like my neighborhood's going to come together and do something about this. So it's less, like I said, less tangible, but super important of how people feel connected. Okay, the last building block is about policy. And here we go from the first target being the policies that govern child and family services. So what's going on with child care subsidy? How do, how do providers progress through their qualifications for working in the field, those kind of things. Then we get into workplace and other policies that support families in raising children. And I often think of that as sort of the pocketbook issues. Is there paid sick leave? Do people have opportunities to have flexible work schedules when that's what they need? Are we promoting family-friendly workplaces and scheduling so people can make their childcare schedule match their work schedule? All of those kind of things that we can address in city or state or federal policy, but also sometimes happen more at the workplace by workplace level. And finally, the last target here is about land use and community development policies. And that's where, if somebody's planning where to build a new highway, are they thinking about the families that live on the other side of that? Are they thinking about how, the location of an elementary school will affect families with young children? There's a lot of decisions that get made that nobody's at the table with a hat on for early childhood. And if they are, that can influence those decisions pretty significantly, but a lot of times they're not there. Excuse me. I see that there's some good information coming in the chat. I haven't read those in detail, but I know that we will come to them in a minute here. So, as I talk about the building blocks, you can see themes throughout it that relate to the Strengthening Families Protective Factors, but the two bodies of work have not been under the same umbrella always. So we're working on bringing them closer together. And really the way we talk about that is what can our community do in each of these building blocks to ensure that families have opportunities and supports to build their protective factors. So merging those building blocks and protective factors, it's not that we build a different protective factor in each of these building blocks or something like that, but it's more like we've done a lot of work that focuses on what our services are doing to ensure that families have support to build their protective factors, and that work is really important. But what's happening in neighborhoods? What's happening when we think about policies? What's happening with that bigger picture community commitment and making early childhood a priority that does or does not help families to build their protective factors? So we're actually going to use a Google Sheet, and I hope that you can all click on a link in the chat box or just type this in, this tinyurl.com/buildingblocksga. I'm going to show you what it looks like. So actually, I have to stop my share to show that. So this is what it looks like, and I'm happy to see lots of little...
Hey, Cailin, it looks like it's view-only access.
Oh, okay. I think I can...
Otherwise, I'm sure everyone would be on there. Right.
I think I can change this while we all watch. Hold on. Oh, all these little Zoom boxes are in the way. Anyone with the link can
Yeah, that looks like it. So where it says change right there. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so anyone with the link can edit. Okay. All right, I fixed that. Now as you come in, and I think, Jill, that same link will work for that now, right? It's not...
You might just have to refresh their screen.
Okay, so everybody, if you go up to this little refresh, hopefully you'll be able to, if somebody wants to try, just click on a on a box and start typing? I see some cursors popping up here.
It was working for me, so.
Okay, good. All right, so the idea with this sheet is not that you would go through and fill out every single one of these. But if you see along the bottom, we have a sheet about resilience, a sheet about knowledge, social connections, concrete support, and children's social emotional competence. And so what I'm hoping is that some thought has occurred to you about social connections and neighborhoods, and you will go in and just click on a cell and start typing. And so, you know, I'd say social connections and neighborhoods, you might say, we would want to find a location to host play groups in whatever neighborhood that doesn't currently have something like that. So you would be able to type in, it doesn't have to be super detailed. It can be general. You know, you might type this, but say a location to host play groups in some neighborhoods, or you might name an actual neighborhood in your community where you think that's needed. And you can go in and type. I'm gonna.
People are typing in. If you refresh your screen as well, I bet that because I see.
Oh, thank you. I might be on the wrong tab too. Yep, I see things popping up on the resilience tab, and you can click on the tabs across the bottom to type other things. I'm seeing some great ideas coming in here already. And I see like the host a parent cafe is a great idea that actually can build all of these protective factors. So don't feel like you need to type it in everywhere, but that's a great suggestion that actually meets a lot of needs at once. So I'm gonna be quiet for a minute and let folks type in. If you're having a hard time accessing that, let us know in the chat or Q&A, and we can try to troubleshoot. But let's take a minute and let folks type. I'm seeing things pop up, which is fantastic. Oh, and I see Michelle typed into the chat box, maybe having trouble with the Google, but or with the Google form, and that is a perfectly legitimate way to get your content in. I'll actually copy it in to the box here. So that was for social connections. There we go. And I see Veronica typed about a kid's cooking class. That's a very fun idea. I think maybe that goes in a particular neighborhood. I'm not sure where you meant it, but it could fit a lot of different places. But we'll put it under social connections and neighborhoods. Okay. I love seeing that people have ideas about this. And I see we have the majority of them coming in on the resilience tab, which might just be because it's the first one. And they might be things that apply across all the protective factors as well. Realizing should make the text wrap on these. It's easier to read. Okay, while people are typing in there, Jill, have any questions come in that we should address?
Yeah, I'm gonna flip the ones I had on there. So we had a comment that I was hoping you could expand on a little bit from Leida Doxy. I hope I'm saying that right. So she talked about using strength-based approaches, which she says she's just testifying how amazing that is, and it always really works for her. But she still sees a lot of punitive approaches to helping families, but obviously we know that is not as helpful. So could you give some more concrete examples of maybe those punitive approaches and how you've seen them change in different communities, just to give us some concrete ideas?
Absolutely. What a great question. Yeah, I think one of the things that I've been thinking so much about in the last few months is that, you know, we often talk about like parents' willingness to ask for help, or you know, the sort of, is it stigmatized to ask for help? And I think we need to acknowledge that one of the reasons it's stigmatized and one of the reasons it continues to be stigmatized, and how we reinforce that, is that a lot of times for a lot of parents, asking for help comes with consequences. Like, you ask for help and then that results in a call to CPS. And CPS in too many cases is not a supportive response, but a punitive one. And so how do we create, I don't even want to say systems, but how do we build communities where you can ask for help and the first response is going to be helpful, is going to be strength-based and supportive. And it can be frustrating when we're operating in that way, but others within our community or within the systems that our families have to interact with are not. And so we want to say, ask for help. We'll always meet you with a smile and, you know, help you problem solve and be strength-based. But we know that if they just, you know, call the next number on the list, they won't get that reaction. And so that can be really hard. We really want people to get that response consistently across the community. So I think the question was for a couple examples, not just my rambling thoughts.
That's a really good point, that when we think of just ask for help, it means something totally different for someone with a middle class perspective or upper. It means, you know, there's a lot available to you versus someone who might be penalized.
Right. Right. And I think when we talk about stigma, it's like, oh, I don't want anyone to think I'm not a great parent naturally or whatever. But it's actually more of, I don't want CPS knocking on my door. I know how other families in my neighborhood have been treated. I know that, you know, because of my race or social class, I'm going to be treated poorly in a lot of the systems I'm going to interact with. So I'm making an evidence-based decision not to ask for help. And we can't fault people for that when that is the reality that they have lived or they know others have lived. On a more positive note, I'll share some examples that I really like. So this doesn't work everywhere, but in Idaho, as you maybe it's just in Boise, Idaho, the CASA program, so that's the court-appointed special advocate who, you know, represents the child's position in family court cases. All of the CASA volunteers in Boise got trained in protective factors and started, they actually got together and changed the form that they use to report to the judge on how a family is doing. And they basically switched the order. So it started with, what positive changes has this family made? What strengths does this family have? And what concerns do I still have? As opposed to the way it used to be, which was sort of, here's a list of all the problems the family has. Which of them are still problems? What does the family still need to do? And a last question that was like, have you seen any positive change? So they just really flipped it. And that was really important for the CASA volunteers themselves, because while I love that people volunteer for that role, a lot of times people come into it with a feeling that they're there to rescue children, and they may not be inclined to see the family strengths as their first out of the gate. So giving them that training and then changing the paperwork to really back it up and say, we start with what's going well. We start with what we see in this family and the potential and the work they're doing. And then we talk about what's still a matter of concern. That's really powerful. But then to hear the stories of parents who sat in the courtroom and heard that report to the judge in that flipped order instead of the negative way was just transformative for those parents. That's so much more motivating. Like, oh, they see what I'm doing. They see my strengths. I'm going to keep working on this. I'm going to keep trying. So
I love how easy that is. That's such, you know, anyone can do that within their program right now. And it's training only the families to hear amazing things and keep going. But, you know, just perspective shift from workers even. So that's a really great example.
Right. And, you know, I think I started that by saying it's not possible everywhere. CASA programs are different everywhere. CASA relationships to courts and to the child welfare system can be different in different places. But if you're in a place where that is a good enough relationship that you can make changes like that, it can be really powerful. Caseworkers can do similar, you know, and family court judges can just say, anybody who's going to report to me about a family, start with what they've changed that's positive, what their strengths are, and then we'll talk about what's still needed. I think that can be really powerful. I was going to share one other example.
Our director just said that's such a great idea. She's contacting our CASA people now.
Oh, good.
They're not already doing it. They're a great informed team.
Love that. I was going to share another example outside of the child welfare, and it's slipping my mind right now. One thing I was going to say, and this is more about, you know, just willingness to ask for help. I think there have been some really great mutual support efforts that have grown up out of this COVID crisis. And the example I'm thinking of is a community in California where they got a grant for a lot of food to provide to the neighborhood, but then it wasn't really clear who needed it or how to find out who needed it. And what they ended up doing was working with a fathers group. And in this group of fathers who were very connected in their communities, several of them were unemployed as a result of the work shutdown and the stay-at-home orders. So those fathers became the delivery drivers into their own neighborhoods and communities. So they were going to the central spot, filling their car up with food, and then driving back to their neighborhood and getting it to the families that knew and trusted them to let them know they needed it. And there was very little, if any, like formal entity involved in that. There was like a spreadsheet somewhere. It was probably a Google sheet like this of, you know, who needs some help and I can drop it off on Thursday, you know, like that kind of informal community mutual support that sprung up. That's existed in communities forever. That's kind of the definition of community, but in a lot of places, I think we've gotten so accustomed to formal services and to kind of this family bubble idea that we take care of our needs and we don't reach out too much for help, whether that's stigma or all the other issues we've talked about. But when it was sort of this time that like almost everybody needs help right now, and some people are more available than usual to provide that help. So let's put that into action. And I thought that was really powerful.
Yeah, and that's reinvesting back into the community members as well to provide that.
Right.
But it's because I always think like I have to call someone to do a service rather than recruit people around me, and has to be this formalized process. So it's a really great point that we can be that person.
Yeah. Were there other questions that came in?
We had, so someone was just curious about around economic stability, if you had anything that was something you had seen in any state or even nationally that was a policy that was kind of more uplifting, or in your opinion, some implementation programs that have been more successful? Because I know that one's a longer, takes a little bit more time to really invest in.
Yeah. So I will say that CSSP has taken a position of advocating for a child allowance to really boost economic stability among families with children. And that's something that we know has worked in many other countries, but hasn't really been done in the US. But I think what comes to mind for, you know, promising interventions on a large policy scale, I'd say universal basic income, which is very, you know, very much on on the same track as a child allowance, different in some key ways. You know, that's being piloted in a number of cities in the US, and the pilots in other countries have shown really positive results. And I think we just know how much economic stability affects family and child well-being. And I think some of that is just because of basic needs being met or not being met, but so much of it is just about stress. And it's, you know, if you're using all your mental energy on finding your next meal or making sure you have a place to live, you just aren't going to be, most people aren't going to be able to then say, I'm going to get down on the floor and play with my baby for 15 minutes. Or, you know, I should really make that call about this developmental delay I'm concerned about. Like, it's just not in most people's ability to struggle with basic needs and also do those higher level parenting things that we want people to be able to do. So I think universal basic income is really promising. At a more programmatic level, I will say we've been involved in the National Center for Parent, Family, and Community Engagement for Head Start and childcare. And CSSP's contribution to that has been largely around family economic mobility and how Head Start programs can help parents to establish credit and, you know, and get whatever benefits they're eligible for, and just all of those pieces that come together. And, you know, that's a really two-generational approach that Head Start has taken for a long time, but getting much more concrete about what it really means and what training Head Start family support workers need, or family service workers need, to support families in that way. But all of those materials are available to anyone.
For it. I know they have an economic mobility toolkit that they put out. It was interesting, so I was going to find that link.
Yeah, so that's something that if you work directly with families or you work with folks who work directly with families, you could use that toolkit. It's available for anyone. It was developed in that national center, but it's not limited to Head Start.
Okay, I'm putting that one in the chat box. So if you guys have any other questions, keep putting them in the chat box. I know people were filling out the Google form a lot.
Yeah, and I think people can keep typing into that. Our resilience one is definitely the most full. Thank you all for typing in there. I'm going to switch back to showing my slide. Let's use the switching here, but if anyone wants to, you know, comment on something you saw someone else type in, you know, feel free to throw that in the chat box or raise your hand. That we could probably unmute someone if you wanted to speak.
Yeah, and then I just saw, so our director just contacted CASA and they said that they had already updated the report template with the strikes-based one. So Georgia, we're there.
That's great. I will, the next time somebody asks me about that, I will share Georgia as one of the CASA programs that are doing that. So thank you. That's fantastic. Yeah, I see lots of comments. I had originally started pulling the chat box things into the Google Sheet. I didn't get to continue that, but folks can see it in both places. I want to go to my next kind of question, because as I said, we have those three themes that run through. And how do we ensure that our efforts in each of these areas promote equity, parent partnerships, and a focus on results? If you look in the Google Sheet, I'm not going to switch my screen back because I think most of you are already in there. There is another sheet that's focused on these themes. How can we ensure we're promoting equity, parent partnerships, and a focus on results? And some people actually already started writing in there, which is awesome. So if you want to go to that last tab by clicking on the little arrows at the bottom of the screen, you can enter some more in there. But I'm wondering if anything else has come in the chat box that we should discuss while folks are typing.
So we had one comment that was saying that it appears throughout COVID-19, there's a dynamic where people are more willing to be seeking help and assistance in the past few months, particularly at food banks and food pantries. And I also think, you know, the more people experiencing, the less stigmatized it is, especially that situational poverty that so many are going through. Do you have any other?
Yeah, I think that's really true, is when it's not, you know, you're not feeling personally embarrassed that you're in this situation. I mean, some people still would be, but most of us can say, this has nothing to do with me. I'm just in this situation and my neighbors are too. And so let's find out how we can help each other. I think that has been powerful. And I hope that that kind of I think at the beginning of the pandemic, we were talking about it like leveling the playing field. And I think we've seen that that has not been entirely true. The playing field being slanted and from the beginning, it's only gotten more slanted. And so the negative effects of the pandemic, both health and economic, are being felt more by people of color and people who were already struggling financially. But all that said, there is still, to some degree, at least with this sense of shared, lots of people are out of work or had hours cut back. Lots of people are struggling with juggling kids being home from school and childcare and all of that. Like I don't like to use that phrase of that it leveled the playing field, because we know it didn't fundamentally, but it did maybe make some people have more empathy for folks who were going through hard times, because it was clear why, where oftentimes we don't seem to have that understanding or empathy. And I think a lot of people, if you're in a community that's hard hit, reaching out to your neighbor and saying, hey, how's it going? We're in the same boat, is a little bit easier than it had been in normal times.
Yeah, and it's a lot easier because we can almost point the blame or point the finger to COVID. Like, I'm here because of COVID. We're in times where the economy is good. It's more of an individual thing, like this is my fault, or there's a lot of individual blame, versus right now that kind of blanket statement of COVID is a lot easier to ask for help.
Right. I'm going to see what folks are writing into the chat here. I'm seeing, promoting equity, parent partnerships, and a focus on results. In the commitment level, I see allow for a free flow of communication through experiences and watchdog groups to follow policies and laws, et cetera. I think that's really important, that people are aware and paying attention, and somebody's kind of on the case, keeping people in power accountable, that that commitment is followed through on, and that it's done in equitable ways, and the right people are at the table, and all of that. Under services, I see survey parent need. Under neighborhoods, I see form regional communities for the city, build plans to verify service needs are available in all cities. I see Georgia Appleseed, which I'm not familiar with.
It's an advocacy group here that has an equity lens.
Oh, great.
For families. Mm-hmm. And someone, please put in the chat box if I'm wrong. That is my.
And under policy, I see limit industrial zoning to green space and services ratio in poor neighborhoods. Absolutely. That we look at those neighborhoods that have been ignored or marginalized, and find ways to change those zoning laws so that they get more amenities and more green space. And legal advocacy, which is so important. We have a program called Dulce that's it's implementing family support in a clinic for families when they come in for the well child check between 0 and 6 months. And it uses medical legal partnership to address legal needs, in addition to having a family support specialist who addresses other types of family needs and thinks about protective factors for each family and with each family. But the legal aspect of that is just so huge, because people don't know their rights, or they don't know how to access help to get their rights, to actually get what they deserve. Because it seems like, legal services are always really expensive, and it's just hard to know who can advocate for you. But when you have someone making that connection to legal aid or medical legal partnership, families have, are getting needs met that then give them the ability to focus more on the baby and the positive things they want to be focusing on, instead of worrying about eviction or immigration status or SSDI payments or whatever it might be, that in a lot of cases, once you put a lawyer on the case, it's pretty easy to solve, but people on their own just don't know how to navigate those systems.
Yeah, and a lot of times, if it's a landlord or something like that, they know that their tenants probably cannot go to a lawyer, and so they're betting on that as well. So we have a representative from Georgia Appleseed saying that they advance justice for all Georgia's children with a particular focus on children experiencing poverty children with disabilities, and children who experience the effects of institutional bias and racism. So justice requires that every child has access to strong, nurturing schools and healthy homes. So you can see it all in there, and please post the website link as well, or I can. So they have a very eloquent and needed mission.
Great, thank you. Okay, so I wanted to kind of step back. Thanks to everyone for typing in your thoughts. And you can go ahead and use the chat box or raise your hand to be unmuted if you'd like to speak up in the conversation. But just kind of wanted to ask us all some of these questions about when we try to get concrete about working in these building blocks. Who do we need to partner with? There are folks like Georgia Appleseed or legal advocacy groups that would be hugely helpful to partner with. Sometimes if we're thinking about neighborhoods, housing providers can be great partners, particularly ones that have a mission of community development. They're looking for ways to partner. They might not be doing a lot around early childhood, but they know that's a big segment of their population that they serve. So bringing them some ideas for what to do with the families with young children in their housing developments can be really a great opportunity for partnership. Are there particular neighborhoods or population groups that should be the focus of our efforts? Some things you want to do might be citywide, but some it might be, we know this neighborhood is struggling, whether that's through kindergarten readiness data that points to particular zip codes, or just knowing that there's a neighborhood that is cut off from the rest of the city, or that doesn't have basic services access, or doesn't have green space. How can we focus on that neighborhood? Where are there opportunities to enact change now, and where will it take more time? I think a lot of this is about finding that opportunity, whether it's politically because there's a champion who wants to make this change and has some power or funding strings or whatever to do that. And you want to leap at that opportunity, even if it might not have been the top thing on your priority list. It's a good thing to do when you have the opportunity, so you run with it. And where are there things that are going to take longer, but are worth putting in the planning and outreach and everything? And here I will say, on the note of things taking more time, I think when we do authentic parent engagement, it's going to take more time. You need time to build relationships. You need time to, if you're sharing something, sharing a plan and you want feedback, you can't assume that somebody's working a desk job where they have a chance to do that. Like, you need to build in more time than you would for feedback from your partners in other agencies. And sometimes you just need to know that entire meetings will just be about relationship building and trust building. And that is good. That is fine. But often we might say, well, we've got this funding runs out on this date and we have to get this done, and we're, trying to move a quick agenda. We need to build in the time to do the relationship building and trust building so that we can do things well and not just do them fast. And then this question about what needs and disparities have become clear in the COVID-19 crisis, and we've already touched on some of this, but where does rebuilding offer opportunities to make things better? I just saw a quote from someone who was saying, our society only makes huge improvements in times of crisis. And so, not to say we're capitalizing on a crisis, but just to say we're in a position where a lot of things are going to come back different than how they've been, out of necessity or out of realizing how unfair and biased some of our systems are, that we really need to think differently about things. So where do we have those opportunities to make things better in any of these building blocks, or just overall in our systems? So I'm looking at the chat box. Thank you for some people typing in yes, like that. And we can make our new normal better than the old normal. I see a message from Angie that says it has become very clear there needs to be some sort of technological initiative to assist parents in getting technology and internet. This may also take more time as well. Some parents may need training sessions on how to use their kids' tablets or laptops. Absolutely. And that's the kind of thing that we don't want that to take time, because we want, kids to be able to jump right into school and families to be jumping right into whatever they need. But it does take time. There's a learning curve. It's hard to figure out how to do that. without face-to-face contact. There's just so much that needs to be addressed, and we have to let things take the time it's going to take.
And so we have a lot of organizations who have been long rooted in injustices and inequities, and we know, especially in Georgia and in Atlanta, I think we're like top 5 for income inequities and a lot of other health disparities in there. So what are some things that some of our child and family servicing organizations can take on their first step to kind of moving their services in a more equitable way?
There's so much.
I know it's not an easy question or answer, else things might be better, but
yeah, I think CSSP is working with the University of Houston, launching something called the Upend movement right now. That's really about radically rethinking the child welfare system and arguing that, at least in the longer term, we maybe don't need a system like that, because the way that this one was designed and is working is so inherently biased and not working for the majority of families that it serves. And really saying what we need is communities that hold families up and that provide those supports. And this is not, nobody's saying like dismantle child welfare systems tomorrow, but while we work on making it work better for the families who are involved in it right now, we also need to think about, what do we actually want our systems to look like? Why would it be that some neighborhoods or zip codes have so many child abuse reports and others have none or very few? And that's so much about bias and assumptions that are made by everyone from mandated reporters to neighbors. And then of course in the system itself, how those reports are treated. So the system that we have now is really not working. And at least some of my colleagues have come to the conclusion that reforming this system is not going to work. It needs to be fundamentally rebuilt. And there's a lot of conversation going on around that. I encourage you, if your ears are perking up at this, you can go to upendmovement.org. There's going to be a convening later in October that you can register and participate on Eventbrite. You can register on Eventbrite and it'll be on Zoom or whatever. But just, really having these conversations with a lot of different partners who have different experiences in the system, leaders in those systems, people with lived experience in those systems, parents who have been fighting for these kind of changes forever but haven't been heard in some systems.
Can you repeat that website really quick? I'm trying to link it.
Yeah, it's upendmovement.org. You can hear the part I'm not sure about is whether it's .org or .com, but I'm pretty sure it's .org.
I'm going to put the link in the chat box right now.
Yeah, so I encourage you to check that out if you're interested in that, re-envisioning a system and how it could work so that families would never need to get to that point where family separation is even on the table.
So in the Families First Act, they've taken maybe one step, and I know you're talking about a bigger transformation rather than just an adjustment here and there, but the Families First putting more investment to be able to be the best parents possible rather than to, put money into other adoptive parents or foster parents.
Right.
So investing in the parent.
And the other piece that goes with that is that the Administration on Children and Families just launched something called Thriving Communities, Safer Children. That is along those same lines and getting more on the prevention side, where Families First is a lot about what happens with families that are already in the system, but trying to reduce how many, reduce family separations or foster care placements. But this thriving, I'm still learning these words, Thriving Communities, Safer Children is an effort to really say, what does our community need to do that fewer families will ever have any contact with the child welfare system. So I'm excited that that's happening. It's very much in line with our upend thinking. And honestly, it's in line with what Strengthening Families was about from the very beginning, which was to say, let's get away from just talking about families who have somehow touched the system and start talking about what's going on that we can, that many families never do touch the system, what's going right with those families, and how can we help more families thrive in those ways. So all of this work has been a long time coming, but it's really culminating now in some really concrete efforts, both federally, and that name that I keep saying really slowly from ACF is that is an effort with Casey Family Programs and Prevent Child Abuse America. So there's private partners, private funders, and the federal government all coming together on this project, and I think it's really exciting.
Thank you, Jessie. She got the right
link. Thank you.
I had a different one.
Sorry about that. That's also new. I don't have I don't have those things memorized.
Yeah, so before we even get to the need for intervention, we're eliminating, the majority of the need for intervention.
Right. Okay, so I want to just open up for any other questions and discussion. I'm curious about, as we expand the conversation into communities, does that resonate with how you think about your work? Does it resonate with what you've known about strengthening families before? Do you have questions? Anything anybody wants to add in, I'd just love to hear it.
Yeah. So we had a comment that says, I think understanding that not all parents are salaried or work in businesses that make provisions for employees with children. There needs to be more childcare and education support during the times where parents must work. That could take some parent pressure off the parents. And I know the early care system had a lot of inequities and greater needs that the pandemic has really just exposed. So your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think you're so right. We need more evening care, more overnight care, and especially I think one of the areas where I've seen this come up is with some of the really big employers that were not giving their employees their schedules until a couple days in advance. And if you sometimes, you work at Starbucks and you sometimes open and you sometimes close, and you get your schedule on Friday for the week that starts on Monday, how the heck are you supposed to have childcare? Like, it just doesn't make any sense. So I think I want to say this has happened at the city level, that some places have made policies around how far in advance people need their schedules or how predictable schedules need to be. And that is primarily, that's quality of life for everyone anyway, but particularly for parents of young children, that you really need that predictability, or at least knowing 2 weeks in advance so that you can make your arrangements. And then we need those options to be available in the community, that you can have evening care, you can have, that there are providers who provide flexible times of care, but are still formal providers, because right now, if you need flexible times of care, you're probably going with family, friend, and neighbor care. And that can be wonderful in so many ways, but we want people to be able to have more options, and to have licensed and accredited programs that are also providing that kind of flexibility. I think it's a really good point.
Looking back at them. So if you guys have any other comments or questions, please put them in. And then we also know a lot of the childcare shortages, things like that, are due to the industry itself, with the payment of workers and the discrepancies there. I don't know what's more important than raising our children, raising the nation of our next generation. So they put so much into that, and to see the value that we put on it through pay. But also, it's difficult in the front end because a lot of people can't afford it. So balancing that out, are there any good policies in the kind of pipeline or anything that you've seen?
I think it's just really clear that quality care costs more than most families can afford. And most families, most parents need to work in order to, feed their families and keep a roof over their head. but also to have health insurance and other benefits that come with employment. And we need to have government funding that fills that gap between what families can afford and what childcare providers need to make in order to provide quality care, and to keep skilled people in the field. You know, I recently saw a testimonial from someone saying, I used to work in early care and education, but then I got a job as a forklift operator, which required 1 week of training, and I make twice as much. So yeah, I love kids, but I don't love kids enough to live in poverty to be able to work with them. So we need a system that values those early care and education providers. And I think the only way we get there is through subsidy, much, much higher subsidy, and subsidy that many more families would qualify for, not just low-income families. And unfortunately, I can't give an example of a US location that's doing that really well. I will say, okay, I have one. I'm not sure the status of this. Alameda County in California had a referendum for putting a lot more county funding into their first five and the city of Oakland early childhood work. And part of what they were going to fund with that was to raise the minimum wage for childcare to $15 an hour. So that would have been like subsidizing on top of what people were bringing in by what they charge, to ensure that everyone had that $15 an hour minimum, because California has a minimum wage, but childcare providers are not covered by it. So I believe it was a really close referendum when they voted on it in the spring, and then the spring happened, and so I don't know the status of that, but that was an effort there. And I think the other, I don't know, sorry. One other example I heard that was not specifically about childcare compensation, but it was a referendum strategy I thought was really interesting, was about doing these referenda for public funding, but pairing two issues together that, so I think in the Alameda one, it was actually combining the children's hospital and other children's programming that people might be more inclined to vote for it when they saw that it was also supporting the hospital. I've seen this in a totally different area around public transportation, where a public transportation levy was going to be used to also fund repair of roads and bridges. So it's like, whether you're someone who drives or someone who uses public transportation, you could see that this was a way that your tax increase was going to go to supporting things you cared about. So I think we need to get really creative about that.
Yeah, so Rosia Eskew, and she is part of our Georgia chapter of American Academy of Pediatrics, just posted in a good link from Childcare Aware that it looks like there's a good brief that they posted today. And we had another really great just example of how paraeducators make $7.50 an hour. They assist with special education youth in the schools. How can we retain them, those great educators, if they can make the same money or more working at McDonald's or really anywhere, since that's about the minimum wage. So it's a great way to appreciate them through those subsidies or other ways.
Yeah, and I think we, you know, for so long we have said, well, if you love working with kids, you should be doing it for love, not for money. But like, the reality is people also need to pay their own rent and pay for childcare for their kids and all of that. And so it's this sort of minimizing of the profession that's saying, oh, this is just something you do because you love doing it, and you shouldn't get too hung up on what you get paid to do it. But life is more complicated than that. And our systems don't always recognize it.
Yeah. And just in those labor markets. Okay, look here. So we have some really great links in there for anyone. And we're kind of coming up on time. So I just wanted to ask if you have any closing thoughts. We know that this is a chaotic season going on with so many different things. Every time 2020, you feel like it can't take another turn. It just seems to. So any final thoughts and strength-based approach and protective factors for all of us out there on the front lines or helping and supporting those out there?
Yeah, I will just say, I think we're all finding our way through these crises, and it can be hard sometimes to stay strength-based, especially when we're, I think at the beginning of this pandemic, but for some people it's continued where every family you talk to is in crisis. It can be hard to keep that, to take the time to build a relationship. It can be hard to, not just jump into problem solving, but to be more intentional with that conversation. So we actually put out a document in May about staying strength-based in times of crisis, which I encourage you to check out. You can go to our website, cssp.org, and right at the top, one of the things you'll see is our COVID-19 clearinghouse, which includes that resource and a resource for parents about staying resilient during troubled times, which I know that Prevent Child Abuse Georgia and Strengthening Families Georgia have also shared. And then I'll say, I think we're all becoming so much more aware of how all these systems affect our lives and everyone's lives. And if that's a silver lining, I wouldn't have chosen to have this experience to get the silver lining, but I think we're coming out of it, hopefully in some ways with greater awareness of the unfairness of our systems and the need to address that. And then just, things like that our childcare system was already struggling to meet need, and now we're losing capacity in that. So I think there's a lot to take forward from this crisis.
And rebuilding those opportunities.
Exactly. And so I'll say at cssp.org, you can find, we've been putting out a series of policy briefs about policy initiatives that we think are needed in a pandemic and beyond. So about childcare allowance, paid sick leave, a few other policy issues. And those, as I said, can all be found at that the COVID-19 clearinghouse on our website. So I encourage you to check that out, follow us on social media, stay in touch. And I think that's all I have to share for today. So thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much for coming on. And one of the great parts of the virtual conference is that we're able to have national kind of leaders in this field come present to us in a more easier way just to spread the knowledge around. So thank you again so much, Cailin. Really appreciate it. And for everyone, I just posted the evaluation link in our chat box, and I will email it out afterwards as well. You'll be able to find this recording and the slides on our website. I'll promise for tomorrow, not later today, but tomorrow. And if you have any questions, you can reach out. So thank you so much and have a good one, everyone.
Thank you. Take care, everybody.